Today in the studio, we have Barry Mazor, expert on many topics, but today we're going to talk to him about Jimmie Rodgers. He wrote a biography of Jimmie Rodgers and the history of the Bristol Sessions, and so we're going to sit down today to talk to him about the background of Jimmie Rodgers and leading up to and past the Bristol Sessions. And also here is Scotty Almany. And Scotty, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Scotty Almany. My job title is so long, but I guess I'll say it. I'm the Digital Media Programming and Exhibit Logistics Manager for the Birthplace of Country Music Museum. And we recently acquired the Jimmie Rodgers 1928 Triple Alt 45 Martin guitar on loan to display in our museum. And so for part of the programming to go along with that, we decided to do this podcast. And when we were putting together a list of folks to talk to, Barry, your name definitely came up pretty quick. And yeah, thank you for, agreeing to meet with us and talk about it with us today.
Sure. My pleasure.
Well, so the first question, it's pretty open-ended, but we just wondered if you could tell us just a little bit about Jimmie Rodgers' early life.
Sure. There's a lot of mythologies about it. He was from the little but burgeoning city, really, small city of Meridian, Mississippi, born in 1897, which is kind of crucial in itself in terms of what he was exposed to and how. But it was a time of great explosions in popular entertainment. A great deal of emphasis is put in a lot of tellings of the story of him as like he was a disappointed railway worker or something. The opposite was true. By the time he was 12 years old, he was already thinking about how can I be a performer. His mother had died when he was quite young, 6, and his father was a railroad section chief, which meant an overseer of people who laid in the tracks, that kind of thing. And, like a lot of show business kids to be, his dad wanted him to have a straight job, and the railroad, like he worked, was that straight job. But by the time he was 12, he had run away to join a tent show. He was up on live vaudeville, which was the main thing at the time. He had a record collection as soon as that was possible, very important. He was a fan of the incoming silent cowboy movies, and the life he led, his early life was, you can think of it as a kind of a Huck Finn life, if you think of it that way, with dad away all the time working and no mom. He lived with his aunt, and you would find him in barber shops, pool halls. These were where guys hung out, and they were traveling entertainers or salesmen, politicians. He wasn't hanging with Mississippi's finest. And that was the life he led, and he wanted to sing. He was fascinated by that, and he was married a couple of times, briefly when very young, which didn't go well, and then the marriage that lasted him and counted him, where his daughter Anita came from, to Carrie Williamson, who was from a respectable family in Meridian, and dubious at first, but it worked out. They were married for the rest of his life, and as much as he would travel, that was where he would think of his home base till he eventually relocated to Texas. But in between there, this thing happened at Bristol, that was unlikely, unheard of, which is that he got found. A guy like him from a small town, and you could say this of virtually everybody who came to Bristol, that there was going to be a route by which he could become one of these recording stars,
right,
or a professional entertainer at all, seemed really impossible, unlikely. Nobody had any idea how to do it. But this was the route. He kept his ear open, and by the time of Bristol, he had been performing professionally through most of the 20s. He was diagnosed with tuberculosis by 1924. The railroad people didn't like the time off he was taking to perform. That was an unhealthy job, was another thing. So more and more, it looked like performing was going to be the way for him to make a living if he could find a way to do it. So he had formed a small jazzy band with his sister-in-law, Elsie McWilliams, who would be crucial in his career. She was a songwriter, too. And that was for a while. He worked for tent shows and vaudeville shows out around the country, where a lot of the things he did later were already on display, lest anybody think they were like made up in the spot at Bristol or after he'd been doing this. Blue yodeling, the whole thing, which we'll get into. So, but he saw himself as a Southern vaudeville entertainer who sang a lot of yodeling blues. He didn't know he was the father of country music, and nobody else did either for many years, because nobody asked the question for a long time. I mean, nobody cared who was the father of country music for decades to come. That would come later. One of the things that became very clear is that it is true that he and his wife had tried desperately to get record companies, Brunswick for one, which the Carter family had also been turned down by.
Right.
In fact, Victor Records. I have a copy of the letter that they sent to Victor Records less than a year before he met Ralph Peer, where you're sitting, and they turned him down outright, because they generally did. So things were blocked until the connection was made there at Bristol with Ralph Peer, who would become crucial in his musical life.
Now, before we move on to the next question, can you tell us a little bit about what the state of the entertainment industry was as Jimmie Rodgers is, maturing into a young man? Vaudeville is still going on. Blackface is still going on. What was entertainment and the music, quote unquote, industry like before he became a performer?
Well, it was really becoming an industry. Music publishing had been great. People from all kinds of places and classes had more disposable cash on hand than there had been in a long time. So there was this musical explosion around 1919 and the years right after. And one of the reasons there was any interest in selling to small-town Southern whites, to black people, to other ethnic groups, is that they had money to spend for the first time, and there was a possibility there might be something there. There was such an explosion in the selling of records. People don't understand this often or realize it. There were more records sold in 1919 to 20 than there had been to after World War II. A lot of the popular culture that we all grew up with happened then. Radio hit in the 20s, and by the time the same year of Bristol, that 1927 year I always point to as look at the context that Bristol happened. A few weeks before Bristol, Al Jolson was doing The Jazz Singer.
Wow.
Sound movies are coming to us. The newspapers are so mass that people like, say, Babe Ruth hitting 60 home runs that summer. Or Mickey Mouse, or Charlie Chaplin, or Rudolph Valentino were becoming more famous around the country and sometimes globally than anybody had been able to be famous before.
Wow.
So Bristol was part of this mass popular culture that was all taking off at the same time. This newfangled thing called radio was exploding. And in 1927, the same people, Sarnoff and Company, who put together RCA Victor Records, put together something called NBC. You hooked up a bunch of radio stations and you had a national network, which meant radio mattered more in what you could do on it than ever before. So all these things were happening at once. It was an explosion of technology. At Bristol, there was one more element added. The records had been around for years, but they had been a very limited fidelity. And the technology came not long before that. That meant they called it orthophonic at Victor, but everybody was working on this.
Right.
Basically, it was the same. It was the same technology that was being applied to sound movies, but you were using it for records.
Right. Western Electric was developing movies, soundtrack.
Yes, it was all the same. It was the same sound increase that was happening.
Right.
So it also meant that you had higher fidelity recording, which made the recording experience seem much more intimate. And when a guy and then the crooners came along, the Gene Austins, and the Bing Crosbys, all those people, they were singing at a much more intimate, quiet kind of way. Nobody's shouting at anybody like you did across an auditorium.
Right.
Well, it totally changed. It totally changed what the recording industry and popular singing sounded like.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and Rogers was part of that. Part of that. He sang like popular crooners, not like Roy Acuff would tell people, I sang in theaters with determination, which meant he shouted a lot. That was the way people. That's what people were doing.
Right.
That's what people were doing, and it's changed. And all of this created an intimacy, which set it up for people to feel very connected and close to artists who did that. And that's the situation Ralph Peer walked into and said, and said, what can we do here?
Right.
Yeah, it's really funny. I was doing some reading on early radio a couple weeks ago, and just to mention, you mentioned, radio was developing, and it was kind of like the cell phones and everything of the day. Heinrich Hertz, who I guess discovered radio waves, I've read a quote from him that was like, I feel like there's not going to be any practical purpose of this discovery. But boy, was he wrong. I mean, radio frequencies.
Well, everything takes time. I mean, think about it. When radio and the telephone came along, everybody understood exactly how they would be used. Radio was for person-to-person, ship-to-shore, and personal communication, and the telephone was in every home, so they could play orchestras over the telephone. That was the original thought. Well, they were wrong for about 70 years until they became right.
Yeah. But yeah, the next question, you touched on, what happened in Bristol already. So I thought of it as a more, kind of targeted question. So what brought Jimmy to Bristol in 27? Was he targeted maybe by Ralph Peer via Ernest Stoneman, or did they just see the ad in the paper?
We don't know. In their case, it was neither one. They both had vaguely heard of each other before this. Jimmy and his band, the so-called Entertainers, who hadn't been together very long at all. We'll get to that, I guess. But they had been playing in Asheville, North Carolina, and they were on the radio locally, occasionally in Asheville, North Carolina. And among the people who heard them there was Bascom Lamar Lunsford, the kind of folklore singer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Who knew Ralph Peer well. They went back to his days with OK Records. He had recorded them. They were friendly. Ralph knew that Lunsford was discovering, writing about, and promoting people, so he was aware. And there's evidence that Lunsford had let Peer know that there are these pretty decent guys on the radio here. There's this guy Jimmy Rogers. He's not bad. So he'd at least heard the name. They hadn't invited them specifically or known exactly where they were. But the fact is, not very long before the Bristol sessions, Jimmy and the Entertainers had played some shows at fairs around Johnson City. Mm-hmm. And there's reason to believe that they heard, that so-called ad had happened. And the word was out that, these scouts are going to be around looking for entertainers around there then. So they kind of knew, and even that wasn't what specifically brought them there that weekend. They got themselves there that weekend because Jack Pierce, one of the Tennifer Ramblers, those entertainers, lived around there, and they were all broke, and Pierce wanted to talk his father into buying him a new car. And they had reason to be in the area at the same time these sessions happened. And once they were all there, they all rolled in and said, "Well, we're here to try out." And whether it struck a bell with Peer, he kind of heard of these guys or not, that's how they got there. Coincidentally, the sessions were on, and they walked in.
Now they were the Jimmy Rogers Entertainers, and did they change their name specifically to come to Bristol, or what's the circumstances of it? What was the name of the band?
Yeah. It was the other way around.
Okay.
The Tennifer Ramblers, I think that's how it's pronounced. I've never been absolutely sure.
Sure, right. Either have I. Right.
It's Tennessee and Virginia.
There was a food distributor here that used the name too for years. I grew up here, and we always pronounced it Teneva. So I've heard
which is what I used to do, like rhymes with Geneva, but it is two N's. So I've been led to understand that they were saying Teneva.
Yeah, I think so too.
In any case, that band had been together. Jimmy was constantly looking for. He thought it was good to have backup.
Right.
As much as, sort of folky people always want to hear him alone with his guitar and without all that schmaltz on there, he always wanted that schmaltz on there, some kind. And they were around. He had different people that backed him up, and they had not been together very long, really a few months. They'd met in around May, and they started to do this. And as an outfit, they called themselves, well, basically he called themselves the Jimmy Rogers Entertainment.
Right.
As a lead singer will do. That was his job.
Right.
And, it had been kind of stapled together. They'd done a bunch of shows, and they were traveling together, and here they were. I got to say, it's like it was an awkward combination from the beginning, because the kind of music they played, which was old school hillbilly string band music,
Right.
was the one time with which he was not particularly comfortable. He didn't sing the way those singers did, and they were not particularly comfortable playing vaudeville blues, which is what he wanted, and other snappy numbers. This was a guy who was going around singing, there'll be a hot time in the old time tonight, the man on the flying trapeze, and ta-ra-ra boom die.
Right.
This is the kind of stuff he'd been singing, and I thought his future was in, because, that was popular. A lot of it was old popular. It was really 1890s music he was falling back on. But that's what he wanted to do. And he sang some of the new popular music, like his eventual buddy Gene Austin's, why do you do me like you do, that kind of stuff. So he wasn't doing Ancient from the Hills hillbilly music or any modern variation thereon, and they were. They were trying to make the best of it, because he always tried to make the best of everything.
Well,
that was his nature.
And his image was very, cosmopolitan too. He wasn't dressing like a backwoods, string band member. I mean, did he always have that fashion sense that he kind of became known for later on?
Oh, he always had something. He always had a sense that the way he presented himself was going to be the way they saw him.
Right.
Because he's going to go on to present himself every which way and loose. When he wanted to look like a rambling gambler, he looked like it. When he wanted to look like a cowboy, he looked like it. When he wanted to look like, you name it, he would do that to make it work. And this is part of what the Bristol Sessions were about. Ralph Peer had an agenda there, and the agenda was the reason Victor hired him. He'd been doing roots music, including earlier country music.
Right.
Okay, including the Stonemans and Witter and Grayson. I mean, he'd had sort of hillbilly hits there. Victor hired him because they didn't know how to do it. They had one big hit in the Prisoner song with Vernon Dalhart.
Right.
He was, a semi-opera singer that were doing these old songs. They didn't know how to get hold of genuine from down home singers, where this was part of their culture, and they had these whole repertoires. And so he was looking for people who had songs who expanded on, described, and almost advertised who they were. In Jimmy Rogers' case, he realized pretty quickly he could sing practically anything, that he was the more cosmopolitan guy that you just mentioned, and that might go anywhere. And his songs tended to turn out to be about that. He was a brakeman who was the guy who throws hobos off the train, except when he wanted to be a hobo who was a brakeman, threw off the train. He was an outlaw. He was a family man. He was cosmopolitan. He sang about Lord.
Right.
Yeah.
So, this guy has range, and Pierce saw this, and it was exactly the kind of person he had in mind. He didn't invent Jimmy Rogers, but if he invented somebody, that's who it would have been.
Right.
They found each other right where you are.
Now, in the expanse of Jimmy Rogers' whole recorded career, what he did here in Bristol in 1927 is very small. Can you talk about a little bit about the songs that were recorded actually here in Bristol in 1927?
Well, it's always partly puzzling, because it's what Jimmy chose to do, and there's a lot of different explanations. I think. First of all, they recorded only 2 songs. A number of the acts, as you know, recorded more than that,
right.
4, 6, or 8. With him, it was just 2, because in Pierce's terms of what he needed to do, he wasn't ready. I think why he wasn't ready is almost more interesting than the numbers. The numbers are interesting because Pure made such exceptions to do them. Sleep Baby Sleep, which was the number with the yodel that Jimmy recorded, that was not original. It wasn't the first time it recorded. It had been around for decades as a vaudeville number. It had been recorded as early as 1909. And some of the most famous versions of it, heck, Pure had recorded a version of it with a black vaudeville singer named Charles Anderson, who sang it basically in drag. He sang it like a mother to her baby, which was a popular kind of entertainment in those days.
Right.
Just a few years, like 4 or 5 years before Bristol, he recorded it with Charles Anderson. It's a good record. You should check it out. But different. But even and that's why Sleep Baby Sleep. It was a lullaby from a mama. The other number was semi-original. Jimmy wrote, which was The Soldier's Sweetheart.
Right.
Think about that. It's a song about World War I. The recording in 1927. Well, there's still a lot of vets around.
Right.
But I mean, think about it. It's like doing a new song about a broken-hearted Vietnam soldier in 1984.
Right.
Well, if that's not as hot, it's not a hot subject the way it would have been at the time.
Right, right.
Neither of those are what the hot stuff Pierre was looking. And frankly, he saw tremendous potential in what this guy seemed to be, and the sheer gall in like bringing those numbers. And the other thing was this blue yodeling thing. This white guy sings blues, and not an imitation of anybody in particular. His way that worked and people believed, they just weren't ready. Part of the reason Jimmy had kept being turned down, which is that if you did live blues, you bring in all kinds of verses, you keep going if you need to keep going. If they're dancing, you want to do more to keep it going. You're not looking for 2 minutes and 37 seconds and one record's different from the next record. You didn't maybe even think of it as a song. It was a number you did, and you need another. Well, for the recording business to work, you need them to be differentiated from each other with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and a way to sell them. And Jimmy didn't have that ready yet.
Right.
2 months later, he would, and he would explode with T for Texas, Blue Yodel #1, because it would have a theme. It was different from others, and it had a beginning and an end in the time you needed for a record. He didn't have any of that because he wasn't thinking that way.
Wow. Okay.
Well, so were those the only two sides he recorded in Bristol in 1927?
Yep, that's all there were. That's all there were, and they were lucky to do that. And you already mentioned the falling out with the backup band. I mean, these were related. He also recorded them. Pure also recorded them.
Yes.
As the Hanover Ramblers doing the kind of music they did. He found them squabbling. And in our lifetime, the last survivor of those sessions, who was a little girl at them, remembered the squabble. Everybody did. They came in already fighting between them. They were fighting about the fact that the other guys didn't see themselves as Jimmy Rogers' backup band. I mean, they really didn't. They'd been that out of practical necessity for a while, but it wasn't all they did. And he was getting the billing. It suggested he was going to get the money. He tended to make sure he got the money. And I mean, he was capable
That'll do it.
He was capable of hawking his or somebody else's guitar, taking the cash and not showing up ever to pick it up and use
Right.
for it. I mean, he did what you had to. I mean, he had zero. The people, I don't think they understood, and Pierre didn't understand, that his family was hanging in a hotel elsewhere in Bristol because they had nowhere to live. They were virtually homeless. So all of this was very crucial for him and for them, and it worked out. But I'm not sure, because he instantly decided he was a Victor recording store. Well, it took a while to put those records out. They weren't the hottest records at the session.
Right.
But at this point, he could print up a card that told people that.
Right.
Yeah.
He could say he was an RCA Victor recording artist. Yeah.
He just showed up in New York where Victor Records were and said, "Mr. Pierre, I'm ready for my next session now." But, months later, this was news to Mr. Pierre. And he said, it was like, oh boy, I love the gall of this guy.
Right.
So they recorded again. They went, in fact, to Camden, where the main Victor recording studios were, and they recorded again.
So, so touching on that a bit more, so they did, Jimmy and Ralph Peer did maintain a relationship after the Bristol sessions?
Oh, crucially, Peer was his recording producer. He was his manager, in a very modern sense, and he was his publisher. All of these at once together, which meant that more than ever, Peer wanted the right song with the right guy. You have to understand, immediately with Jimmy Rogers, when the songs hit, they would place them with 8 other people. Jimmy was, in a matter of a year or two, riding around in Cadillacs. His wife had minks. Oh, well, the Carters had mink coats too. He was building a mansion in Texas. All of this was on real money.
Right.
The money did not just come. Well, you couldn't make that much from performing live, even though this recording success meant that he was a big attraction. And Peer got him on the low circuit, which was big time vaudeville.
Right.
Very few people in what we call country music. Uncle Dave Macon did some of that, but very few people in country music were going to get booked for that kind of thing yet. So yes, Peer signed him up with deals. When you see Jimmy Rogers with a Wayman guitar, Wayman was a nice company, but basically Peer knew those people well in Philadelphia and signed him up to endorse him and stick his name on him, and so there were Jimmy Rogers guitars from Wayman, which he hardly ever played. He carried one around to make sure he was seen with it from time to time because it was a sponsor.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, and I think, if we talk about that Morton guitar here, I'll get into that a little too, the connection between them. But Peer set him up with those deals and bookings and all this. They worked incredibly closely. Some of this I understood better when I wrote my biography of Ralph Peer than when I wrote Meeting Jimmy Rogers. Because Meeting Jimmy Rogers, I came to one conclusion, and it's true, which is how much he took care of his own business out on the road. Jimmy would know the manager of this theater in Tulsa is Jack X and X, and his wife is this. He's got 2 kids. His wife is sick. Last time he paid this. He would know all that stuff to glad hand and get the gig with that guy again. And he would go out endlessly. TB or no TB, this guy did hundreds of gigs a year.
Right.
Ralph wanted to see happen also because it promoted the records. This was a new thing that you showed up in a town and there would be records that Victor would make sure were in the store and you would show up for in stores. He did all of those things, and radio appearances sometimes to promote the appearance also. Radio and the record industries didn't quite know how they stood with each other yet. Records were very suspicious of radio.
Right.
It was like the internet, much like the internet later. If the guy was going to be on radio, well, you didn't have to pay for it. You bought for a radio once, and you never had to buy a record again. That's what they were afraid of.
Right.
Victor owed NBC and records because they knew in the long run this wouldn't be true.
Right.
You could promote artists on the radio and sell more records. But that was very unclear to people in those first years.
Now, as a follow-up to the Ralph Peer thing, a couple things. Through the prism of time and history, was the deal that Ralph cut with people like the Carter family and Jimmy Rogers in terms of publishing, is that considered fair? Did the artists and the writers receive the money that they thought that they should get? And then also, as Jimmy's music kind of evolved, like he does sessions with Louis Armstrong, Hawaiian bands, who was driving that? Like, was that Ralph or Jimmy's vision for the music?
Peer and Jimmy's understanding of Jimmy together. Okay, let me get into that because there's been so much just plain wrong written about that. It's just like
great.
Right. The deals that they got were the best anybody had ever had.
Gotcha.
That would be the way to put it. Peer did quote unquote keep control of the publishing side of it. He did in fact share the songwriter share. This gets pretty technical about how publishing and royalties and work, but every record to this day has what's called the mechanical right with it, which is the publishing of the songs on the record. And that's a separate royalty and it's the real way to make money, by the way.
Yes.
Wildly more money in the publishing on the record than in the record, which Pierre understood. And Victor learned real fast after they watched what happened here. Jimmy Rogers was making money not just for his records, which were selling like crazy then. Typically, right after Bristol, they were selling maybe 500,000 a piece a record. And remember, the population of the country was much, much less than it is today.
Right.
That's a huge percentage-wise. That would be, and not only his record, but Gene Autry was covering it. And this artist, and 8, 9 artists would cover the song, all of which would be coming back to Southern music, Ralph Pierre and Jimmy Rogers. His share, the songwriter share of the publishing, which was paid. It's cents on a record, but he's getting that on the hundreds of thousands of records of his songs done by other people.
Right.
This is how you get rich in the music business.
Yes.
It's just about the only way to get rich in the music business then and now.
Right.
Is if you have a piece of the songs. So Jimmy was cool about this stuff. He knew there were real limits to how fast he could write the kind of material they wanted. And he was recording at a rate almost exactly equal to, say, the Beatles and the Stones in the 60s.
Right, right.
Their contract was for X number of albums a year. His for X, there were no albums to speak of in his day. It was a singles business. But if you add up, he did 112 sides in 5 years, which is about the same as they would do.
Right.
Right. They had to keep coming. And yes, Ralph saw early on that he could handle all these different sorts of backing. And at the same time, you wanted novelty so the thing would sell, not like I have that already. So how to balance that is always a thing to this day, right? You can have an argument about it. Every time they have an argument, that's not country. They're having the same old argument.
Right, exactly. Is this authentic? Right.
I always say country's not the same as it used to be, and it never was.
That's a good way to put that.
Yeah, that's a good quote.
So yes, between them, there was this expansive thing of how you record, what it could be, and he was up for it. To get that song, that sheer number of songs, he would write some. He turned to his sister-in-law, Elsie McWilliams, who was musically trained at the piano, to help. He was asking for help. He was pleading for help.
Right.
I need 10 more songs next month.
Wow.
And he would go to a supply of songwriters who could help. Well, he's writing about gambling and rambling and leaving women and running from police. And some of these are... They don't think it's Elsie McWilliams' life, but she wrote half of those with him. I mean, some of this is image that was created.
Right.
The Carters were sold as down home, even when they were divorced and Sarah had run off with a cousin, had nothing to do, as little to do with APP as humanly possible.
Right.
And they still recorded together, and they were still sold as these down home loving family.
Right.
Jimmy was going to be sold basically as this badass. I mean, they were Sunday morning, he was Saturday night.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
and it wasn't quite true of either of them. It just wasn't so simple, like actual human beings.
Right.
You know?
Right.
I mean, he had a family. He was a family man, except when he wasn't, and vice versa. They were all real people.
Right.
But the idea of selling the image and playing into it and finding songs that matched, that was all starting right there. And of course, it never stopped.
Right. And to tie this part up, I think, because you mentioned his home in Texas, did Ralph Pierre, was he involved in the move to border radio at all, or was that...
Well, he helped them. Yeah. All right. We have to see what was the order of things here.
Okay.
What happens in between is the Depression.
Yes. Right.
Jimmy Rogers is selling vast numbers of records, and the Carter family are doing very, very well. But the Depression starts to hit in 1930. Jimmy Rogers, who was, as they say, once I worked on Ralph here, I had all this correspondence between Jimmy and Ralph and got a different idea of just how collaborative the relation was.
Right.
Try this next. The ballads aren't working. Do more of those comedy talking songs you did with the Carters. Get me some more. There would be a lot of that because they could measure what was happening.
Right.
So the bottom fell out. There's a letter where he said to Jimmy, "You keep at it. I'm worried about you. Don't spend so much money." And they spent like crazy. I mean, it came in one hand and went out the other.
Right.
So he said, "Don't do that. It's like harder now." Everybody says, "You're still the top of the heap, but boy, the heap is smaller." When he said that, well, no, yeah, it was not funny. Basically, the recording industry, which, as I said, in the beginning of the 20s was selling like 50 million records a year,
Right.
dropped 16 to 10. It was down to 5 million in all forms, from classical to hillbilly. By this year, Jimmy Rogers is at the top of the heap, and that 500,000 has come to 5,000.
Right.
There's no money in it. He got the people like the Carters and Rogers recording longer, and he took care of them. That's another mythology. He cut out our royalties. Yeah, because there were no royalties.
Yeah,
Right.
Carter's royalties for the first quarter of, I think, 31 were like $62.
Wow.
And he redid their contracts so there was more money up front. What he did, which they didn't exactly understand, he got them bigger advances so they could eat.
Right.
yeah.
So they were getting hundreds of dollars, which is a lot of money in 1931,
Right.
just to show up. And he kept recording with them. And so Jimmy had decided to move during that period. First, it was considered for his health. There was this mythology always that if you went to the mountains or you went out west or you went these places, it would be better for you if you had TB.
Right.
It wasn't true. It wasn't true, but it was very much believed. And basically, they picked up and moved to Texas, where they built a mansion called the Blue Yodeler's Paradise on money he still didn't have, so Pure paid for the mortgage.
Wow.
But it settled. By that point, he knew he was going to have to travel less, and there was within the field and within the area, he could do a lot of work, and they recorded where they had to. But Jimmy wasn't really well, and by the time they finished recording together, Jimmy was dying basically.
Right.
They did last sessions. The thing with TB is he knew it was fatal. There was no way out, and it was very tragic. It wasn't that long before drugs that could prolong it. It's not really curable to this day. It's just fixable. They can make you healthier so you get through it.
Right.
There's people dying of tuberculosis around the world right now.
Yeah.
But it got much more treatable, and just a few years later, there wasn't a whole lot they could do for him but try to be healthy. The most they could do for him is the one thing he would never do, which was rest.
Right.
He just wouldn't. And right to the last minute, he was wanting more recording sessions so he'd have more money to leave to his family.
Right.
That's what it comes down to.
So then the move to the border radio, was that then a play for them to get a bigger audience, with the unlimited broadcasting power, or what was the...
You're talking about the Carters. Okay. The Carters, it's a little different. They went longer.
Yeah.
And Pierre's relationship with Victor Records ended. They wanted him out. Why is this? He was working for most of the time with them as an outside consultant. Well, you know what happens when things get tight. Outside consultants get dropped.
Right.
And the people with the jobs inside, specifically Eli Oberstein, who was the head of those, who was in-house in charge of those lines, said, basically, what are we giving him money for? I'm in charge of this now. What do we need him? And he was wended out of it. But he was still the Carters' manager, remember, and publisher, which had nothing to do with RCA Records. Victor Records had sold Southern Music. They had controlled it for a while. They sold it back to Pure because they thought that there would be trouble with the Justice Department, because under the Roosevelt administration, owning songs RCA Victor, and owning movie companies like RKO and placing songs with the other parts of your own thing look like in restraint of trade. So he was happy to get rid of them so as not to get into legal trouble. And for a reasonable price, they sold the publishing company back to Pierre. Pierre is now a full-time publisher.
Right.
The Carter family, because they had this close relationship, Jimmy Rogers was dead. They were, through the 30s, they were the last act he really managed. And he did them a favor because the recording, but nobody knew if records were really going to come back.
Right.
He worked that deal with Border Radio. That was the biggest audience they ever had. Because unlike Jimmy, they did not tour all over the place. They toured just in their own area. They stayed pretty much in Virginia. They didn't want to do it. Funny thing was they would travel to record, so they recorded in all these different, you see they were recording in half a dozen cities. They go to Memphis for that, but they wouldn't go there to sing.
Right.
They were just like that. They didn't want to do it. And by the time after the divorce, they didn't necessarily want to travel to be together anyway.
Right.
So he cut that deal for them, and it was the biggest thing for them. That was the biggest arrangement they ever had, because once they were on those border blasters with 100,000 watts,
right,
your teeth would literally make your teeth chatter and fences vibrate near where the tower was. You could hear people heard that music in their teeth, and they heard it in the vibrating fences. It covered most of the country.
Yeah.
So people hearing the Carter family, which by now included the second generation with the kids and that kind of thing, and this was Sarah and AP's kids and Maybell's and they were all on there as little kids of family bands, and more people heard the Carters than ever, and it really set them up to continue. They decided to retire during the war, but that was on them. There was only one last time the original Carter family got together after 1941. I mean, there was about to be a big spread in Life magazine about this fascinating Carter family, which Pure had arranged.
Yeah.
And a thing called Pearl Harbor happened.
Yeah.
Seen those
It
photos.
was that week.
Yeah.
So the cover story of Life magazine was not that.
Yeah.
And it didn't appear, and they gave it up. They thought that was their last chance at big-time notice. They gave it up, and as we know, Mother Maybell and her kids would go on for years and eventually do the Opry. Sarah pretty much retired, but then they'd occasionally come back to it. They even recorded again a little with that family, but it was all separate. The last time the original Carter family, the three of them, appeared together, was at the first Jimmy Rogers Day in Meridian in 1953.
Wow.
They appeared there because it was set up as a memorial to Jimmy.
Right.
Yeah.
And they were there, and they sang on the radio. There is a recording of it. So all the books that said they never appeared together after 1940 are once again simply incorrect. They appeared in 1953 to salute Jimmy. I even have some film of that.
Oh,
wow.
wow. That's very cool.
There were home movies taken that show the Rogers family with June Carter at Jimmy's grave.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
Very cool.
Yeah, it is, and I think it's a nice coda on them. How much the matter to each other.
Right.
Yeah, definitely.
Right.
I mean, the contemporaries, honoring each other. But yeah, to go back to, or to go into the Martin Blue Yodel guitar.
Yeah.
So do you know anything about, did he order that like as a custom guitar, or was it gifted?
I do know.
Or
I realized I do know.
Okay.
Oh, cool.
First of all, I know as much as anybody knows. Let's put it that way. There are parts of it where, but it's really easily to surmise. I think if you follow the story chain, you'll see too, which is that, first of all, the whole business with the importance of guitars was a relatively new thing. That's the first thing to be said. Until not all that long before he started to record, Jimmy, like was playing mandolins and banjos. Mm-hmm. I mean, the guitar was not the key instrument in American roots music until relatively recently in the 20s. It was fiddles and banjos. Mm-hmm. Mandolin sometimes. Jimmy played mando and banjos, not fiddle. But you can see him in pictures playing that going around. But beginning with the beginning of recorded blues, you had guys like Blind Lemon Jefferson and Lonnie Johnson, whose records were selling like crazy. Lonnie had been recorded by Pierre himself. And the guitar started to become a more central instrument. It was just a rhythm instrument in the back of some little band, whether it was a down-home band or a jazz band.
Right.
It was just a rhythm instrument. It was no big deal. At home, Martin had made these so-called parlor guitars, small ones in which people were learning to play sort of Spanish guitar, and there was a little booklet, Spanish Fandango. That was for polite music in the parlor, and as a name said. There were some people, other than that, it was sort of a Mexican instrument, Spanish, because of Spanish guitar, who had a tradition of that. So in the 20s, it gets to be a thing. Jimmy doesn't have one. His railroad buddies in Meridian get him a first guitar, which is now in the hands of Marty Stewart, by the way. That guitar, which was a Martin, his buddies bought for him. That was one Martin, so he played that.
Okay.
When he got to Bristol, he bought a little better one, a second one. It was a Martin Odd 18, which is the one you see as a precious jewel at the Country Music Hall of Fame,
Right.
which is the one he used there at the Bristol sessions. Then he made money. And the one you have, which has been estimated to be $1 million guitar, do watch out for it.
I'm well aware. Trust me.
It locked up at Meridian. The way that happened is, it was clear he wanted a fancier new guitar. Like, Maybelle Carter got herself a top-of-the-line guitar, too, from the one she wanted. He wanted a top-of-the-line guitar. And Carrie Rogers, in her memoir, you can look at this, talks about this, which is that different guitar companies were bidding to be the one. And they were all, he had a Gibson that was given to him at one point. He had it in one museum. They sped off in different places, but what clearly was, and he had these Wymans, what clearly was how much Martin to him, guitars meant to him, was proved to me when I saw the correspondence with Ralph Peer. Because years later, one of those Wyman guitars he had with Jimmy Rogers on it got busted. And I got a letter, business mail from Ralph Peer to Martin Guitar. The only ones he really trusts are you. So could he have this Wyman guitar fixed at Martin?
Oh, wow.
So I think that tells you how he picked the one that he picked.
Right.
He wanted it all duded up. The thanks on the back was part of his act. For a lot of applause, and always at the end of the show, you flip it and it says, thanks.
Right.
Yeah.
It's back there. It's for live shows. The inlay cost, all of that cost. It was a top of the line Dreadnought, which is, first of all, you wanted because it was way louder than anything acoustic on the market at the time, which was great for the increasingly bigger audiences he's playing for to be heard. And on top of it, it was customized. So it was Martin he had do it. It made sense. That's what he liked best. They were capable of it, and that's who he trusted.
Wow.
Yeah.
So let's follow the provenance of the guitar a little bit. So Jimmy Rogers dies in 1933. What happens to the guitar after that?
Oh yeah. Well, on that one is clear. Some of these others it took years to figure out.
Right.
This one, boy, there's no question about this one, and we know exactly where it was and how it got where it got.
Okay.
Which is that first when he died, it was in possession of his wife Carrie. She did a like later in Mrs. Hank Williams would do. She did a lot of professional widow of Jimmy Rogers work.
Right.
And because she still remember an awful lot of the money he had gotten in one hand and out the other.
Right.
And it's 1933 when he dies. She's in the Depression too, and there's not a lot coming in, none of his live stuff, and the record sales are plummeting like for everybody. But she would get mail from people who were curious about Jimmy, wanted to know about Jimmy, and she got a letter from a lanky Texas kid just starting out with no money. Could he possibly get a Jimmy Rogers autograph? And his name was Ernest Tubb. He had been so infatuated with Jimmy Rogers that he was scared to go meet him. Jimmy played his town, and people were lined up to pay $1. This is huge money in Texas in 1931 The movies were going bankrupt when they cost a dime. They're giving away dish night, but they paid $1 for Jimmy Rogers and the movie.
Right.
And so that's the world. And they were lined up down the streets. And Tub told later would tell people, I wanted to go in. I couldn't bring myself. I was afraid if I met him that he wouldn't turn out to be who I hoped, and I was so afraid of being disappointed that I didn't go to see the show.
Wow.
So that's how he felt about it. And he would, be dedicated to Jimmy Rogers' memory for the rest of his life. And I showed him my book. She not only got him an autograph. He said, come see me. She was considerably older than he was. Let's just be clear about that. He saw her as a motherly kind of thing and treated it that way. I can't tell you for sure she always did, but there was not an affair from people who think there were that. But there was this close relationship. She saw him as sort of a protege. Maybe I could make this work for you. You cared about Jimmy so much. So she helped get him a first contract. All his first records, some even written by Elsie McWilliams, were about, how we all miss Jimmy Rogers.
Right.
Yeah.
What the first records were. And it doesn't even sound like him. He could yodel at first until he was lucky enough to have his tonsils out and he could never yodel again. And after that, he sounded like Ernest Tubb, which proved to be a very good thing.
Yes, it did.
So she lent him the guitar for as long as he needed it. And in fact, he played it for the rest of his life.
Wow.
But it was on loan. And he always, there are people who think spinning around a guitar and saying thanks was something he made up.
Right.
It became so much a part of what he did.
Yeah.
But he was doing what Jimmy had done.
Right.
And when he died, it reverted to Jimmy's heirs. His one daughter, Anita, had kids. They were the heirs who to this day are the heirs to Jimmy Rogers and the bloodline, they call themselves. And they loaned the Bristow Sessions guitar to the Country Hall of Fame, where it's been ever since as a precious jewel.
Yeah, it's still there.
Get mixed up with this. Yeah, it was there. The precious jewel Martin guitar, which is the Bristow Sessions guitar, is at the Country Hall of Fame and is still on permanent loan. Technically, that's a family possession too. And the guitar, which reverted to the family, Mrs. Rogers was alive and well in Memphis, in Meridian still in those days. The family had reverted there. Elsie McWilliams was there. The Williamson family was there. Carrie would be there sometimes. She did continue to have the house around in Texas, but it gets to be complicated. She raised her kids there. But in any case, when Jimmy Rogers started to be honored, which was the 1950s, as I said, 20 years after he died, a monument went up in Meridian. The beginning of what became the museum there happened. The Jimmy Rogers Day became the event in country music every year for a while, till Nashville got jealous of it. But and everybody would, all these different pieces of country music to which he contributed. The Westerners, the string bands, the cowboys, everybody would converge on Jimmy Rogers Day. So it got to be a thing. And as the museum developed, that was one of the things she put there. I mean, they had everything. They had his lanterns. They had Jimmy Rogers' bed there, which is, at first, when you're not gone that long, fans want to see all this personal stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
It doesn't last forever, but for a while, the first generation is there. They want to see anything he ever touched.
Right.
Yeah.
And it included that guitar, which they would occasionally bring out and very special people would get to play. And that was, by the late 50s when they were making a Jimmy Rogers stamp, all these things happened. And from then, well, here we are. It's 60, 70 years from then.
Right.
It's been there that whole time. And as far as I know, except for times when it'd be brought out to tune or make sure that it was in good shape, or very occasional honored players in Meridian would get to play it. It never left till this trip.
Right.
So this is kind of an honor on how much Bristol still means.
But just to go back, just as a quick thing about, you were talking about, it was kind of like a bidding thing for who was going to make his guitar. That kind of leads me to believe, so was it given to him by Martin, like as a sponsorship kind of thing?
Oh, I don't think it was a sponsorship. I mean, every generation has a CF Martin. I mean, each generation of that family, somebody winds up with those initials.
Yes.
So somebody has them.
Yeah.
And I sat down with the current one not all that long ago, and this came up, and I think what I'm sure of, if you remember what I was saying about how the correspondence with Ralph Peer,
Right.
On making Wyman Guitars a sponsor, or talking to Martin about you're the only ones he's trust. Could you fix this there?
Right.
I'm virtually certain that's the kind of business, non-gig business that I'm almost certain as manager, it would have been Ralph who did it. Once Jimmy said, I want, get me a guitar and I want it to look like this, he probably would have handled all the details and contracting with them.
Wow.
Yeah.
And as far as I know, there was not ever a sponsorship thing, but Jimmy Rogers was the Elvis of his day. If Elvis says, I want to play your guitar, the company doesn't say, are you sure?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're going to talk about that anyway.
Yeah. Well, and what really leads me to believe that, they just probably gave it to him, and we're like, yeah, use this, is that there's a handwritten label inside from C.F. Martin of that time. I don't know.
No doubt. Oh, yes.
If he was
yes,
the
and that all
original.
stands, right in keeping with what we're saying. Yeah, they knew who that was. They knew it was custom. I'm sure he paid a pretty penny for it.
Yeah.
It was an expensive guitar as they went to begin with.
Yeah.
Top of the line, and then they customized it.
Right.
But that was no issue. And I mean, frankly, the guy's driving around with Cadillac, sometimes with his name on the door. I mean, he was happy to advertise how well he was doing, and everybody was happy to see it. This was a guy who still connects with us, and he's rich. We want him to be rich. This is part of what I think ultimately is Jimmy Rogers' central legacy, which is he was a model for somebody like that.
Right.
Up from down home, who can become a star, who can still represent us, unelected. He doesn't run for governor of Louisiana. He's
Right.
Yeah.
He doesn't preach at us. He's one of us. He goes up there. When he gets the money we wish we had too, he visibly enjoys it, which I think people don't understand about country fans sometimes to this day. And it's the same thing. It's the same thing country fans want out of Dolly Parton.
Right.
The same thing they wanted out of Hank. Heck, it's the same thing reggae fans wanted out of Bob Marley. Or, some folk fans wanted out of Dylan. It was okay. There's certainly people wanted out of Elvis. Elvis never, they always knew where he came from. He always knew where they came from. He never lost that connection. So they wanted to see him that successful and do that well. And they kind of vicariously shared in it.
Wow, that's amazing. Because my last question that I was going to ask was, beyond the genre of country music, what is the impact Jimmy Rogers had on popular culture? And I think you just answered that question.
Yeah, it was all of them. I don't know if you know, but I mean, you may have heard that my current project, all of my big projects seem to turn out to be people in the Country Hall of Fame who actually were not only or exactly country musicians, working country. It was true of Jimmy Rogers. It was certainly true of Ralph Peer's business, which was as much Latin music as blues and country,
Right.
jazz. All of those things. Well, I am working on what is going to amount to the first serious full lives and music biography of the Everly Brothers.
Oh, nice. Can we
yeah.
publish that, or is this on the download?
One of the 80 people that I interviewed for meeting Jimmy Rogers to get a sense of his legacy was Phil Everly. And when I talked to him about it, we were talking about the drastically experimental way they did Tea for Texas on their Roots album.
Yeah.
Which is one of the foundations of country rock, that album. And on it is a real crazed version of Tea for Texas and how that came about and why. And I talked to him and he said something which is one of the quotes people take from my book most often, and it's real appropriate. I didn't know I was going to wind up writing about Phil, but he said was, the funny thing, Barry, is people talk about Jimmy as the father of one thing, when the truth was he was the father of so many things.
Wow.
Quote that a lot. Because, blues that could be sung without minstrelsy, proto-Hollywood cowboy music, singer-songwriter confessional music. I mean, TB blues and that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
That guy, and this is my story. modern ways to do American folk balladry. Well, this goes on, Western swing with bands before it had a name.
Right.
So, which is why you find everybody in every one of these fields. Bill Monroe used Mule Skinner blues as the cornerstone of how to create bluegrass.
Yep.
So, and Rough and Rowdy Ways kind of records which prefigured the rock and rollers. So every one of these people have a claim on them, and they're all legitimate.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and
He didn't know he was the father of any of those. He was just trying to please some people and get by.
And make a buck, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and you may know this, the specifics. I can't remember. I always forget. But as far as I know, Jimmy Rogers is still to this day the only person that is in like the Country Music Hall of Fame, the Bluegrass Hall of Fame, either the Jazz or Rock and Roll.
You have to add more than
Songwriter Hall of Fame.
Yeah. And I think the Grammy.
Yep, he is in more of those halls than most.
Yeah.
There are more people in both the Country and Rock Hall of Fame than there were originally, partly because there were people like Elvis and the Everly Brothers, now Jerry Lee Lewis, who who had been taken into the Country Hall, and properly so, of course, who already were recognized by the Rock Hall. And the Rock Hall have taken in Jimmy, for instance, because they have a category of pioneers who paved the way to us.
Yes.
And there's no denying he was that. So you get more overlap there. But yes, he's also in the Blues Halls of Fame, and he's also in the Songwriters.
Yeah.
Every which way you can recognize him, he's by now recognized. I hope I help with that a little.
Oh, definitely. I can't ever remember everyone that it is, but I mean, that's a huge testament to like how big of a deal it is for us to have the guitar here.
I have a picture from Los Angeles. There was when there was a big to-do at the Grammy Museum, at the home Grammy Museum. Of course, there's one in Mississippi now too, which is great. But the home one in Los Angeles is out there, and there was a big show and exhibit that went on for some time about Jimmy Rogers. I'd already been involved with one about Ralph Peer out there, but there was one later about Jimmy Rogers, and I have a photo I treasure, which they sent my way, which is all of the Peer heirs and all of the Rogers heirs together with a glass raised saluting it, because they thought the books I did played a part in making them current again for these exhibits, and that means the world to me. I can tell
nice.
You.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, I actually have one more question, just more of my curiosity of being a native Bristolian and growing up here, and I don't know if you know anything about this or not. But so after the sessions, did any of the artists like maintain a relationship with Bristol and like come back to play music here, or anything like that? Do you know? I mean, outside of the 27 and 28 sessions.
Yeah, I mean, the basic thing is that forget the Carters and Rogers for a minute, because by a year later he had exploded, and when they got around to the second Bristol sessions and even the Johnson City sessions nearby, he was out on the road playing Lowe's someplace out in the country. By that point, Peer would arrange for him, you're going to be in such and such a town at such and such a time, get your songs ready because I'll record you there. I mean, that was like coordinated after a while because the tours just went on and on. The Carters, you had to arrange it. But I mean, after that, I think if you look at who did do those second Bristol sessions and the Johnson City sessions afterwards, which was on a different label, basically. But if you look at that, they were people from the area. One of the points of coming to Bristol in the first place, of course, was the fact that they knew there was talent nearby who could get there, who maybe couldn't afford or have any way to come to New York. Or the percentages on who were going to work out was always iffy, always is. So coming locally worked better. So the percentage of the people on the 27 Bristol sessions who were regional, at least, if not exactly local, is high. And some of those people came back. And I'm sure that if we looked into it, that they performed locally also because it was their territory.
Right.
Yeah. That's just something I've always been interested in, is growing up here and playing live music and always having live music, is how it kind of kept going and things like that.
It was a good place to go because it was in a way as a height as a bustling city,
Right.
and so there were places to play and there were people who would come to see you. So that's always good. That's what musicians look for, and it was one of the places worth hitting. I mean, in the region, look at it. It's not like the Tri-City. That region in general is one of the spots. Certainly in Virginia, you would have gone a long way to find the next one.
Yeah.
And in Tennessee, okay, Chattanooga, Knoxville, but in that corner of this very wide state, ride from Memphis to where you are someday and see just how wide.
I've done it. I know.
North South, not so much, but East West, very wide.
Yeah, very wide.
Mississippi to the mountains. So it was a good place. It was a good regional place to be, and that's part of why it was used in the first place.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well,
Scotty,
I think that's about everything. Thanks a ton, Barry, for taking some time and talking to us.
Yeah, we really appreciate you.
I think these are going to be pretty interesting to hear that you guys have put together, and I hope I was coherent enough to be useful.
Oh, yeah,
Yes,
it was great.
Absolutely.
Great.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Barry.
You guys too. Take care.
All right.
Yep.
Take care.